Welcome to my PowerPoint presentation on my nuclear solution to tunneling in Dead by Daylight. So, what is tunneling? Tunneling is a strategy employed by the killer. It involves repeatedly pursuing one survivor until that survivor is sacrificed and removed from the game. It derives its name from tunnel vision, in which your focus is directed at one thing and all else is ignored. When done successfully, it reduces survivor efficiency by 25%. There is one less survivor to repair generators, heal other survivors, and perform secondary objectives like totems. Tunneling exists on a spectrum and thusly can be perceived differently depending on the circumstances. For example, there may only be one generator left to repair, so the killer opts to pursue a survivor on death hook instead of their rescuer. This isn't a particularly controversial example, as the match is winding down and the killer needs to start securing their objectives. In contrast, you may have a killer who will start to tunnel before the first generator is even completed. This instance is usually regarded with much more scorn, as we'll discuss later. For the purposes of this presentation, I will usually be referring to tunneling as aggressive tunneling, wherein the killer intentionally pursues the same survivor from the start of a match. Before we continue on, I would like to clarify some additional terms. Anti-tunnel refers to any effect that makes tunneling a survivor more difficult. These effects are usually related to perks or base mechanics rather than strategy or playstyle. There is also camping, which is a related term. Camping and tunneling are not the same thing, but it is common for them to be coupled. Camping is lingering near a hooked survivor in order to make their rescue more dangerous. This can be used to chase the rescuer, or can be used to keep tabs on the survivor you want to tunnel. Tunneling is an issue that has plagued Dead by Daylight for its entire lifespan. As mentioned previously, the reduction in survivor efficiency makes it the strongest strategy in the game when successful. This makes it a very alluring way to play for killers. However, most killers don't tunnel off-rip for two reasons. Namely, because of the history tunneling has, survivors commonly equip anti-tunnel perks to protect themselves. This makes tunneling much less efficient. The mere presence of anti-tunnel perks shape the way games are played even if a survivor isn't using them. However, I do believe a good chunk of killers recognize that aggressive tunneling isn't fun for the survivors and isn't a very rewarding playstyle either, so they try to spread their chases to make the match more engaging. At the very least, that's how I usually try to play. Now, what makes aggressive tunneling unrewarding for killer? This is ultimately my opinion, so you may not agree, and that's fine. Because tunneling is so strong, it ends up feeling a little bit like an easy mode. 3v1 matches are exponentially more difficult for survivors and conversely are much easier to manage as a killer. If you get someone out of the match before 3 generators are completed, getting a 3k is fairly easy. Survivors know that death is almost guaranteed and are more likely to throw in the towel. They'll DC, they won't put up a good chase, they'll just go limp. Also, you stunt your skill development in a game as you rely more so on prolonging the match rather than learning how to enhance your chase potential. On the flip side, for Survivor, it's usually not fun either. If you are the tunneled survivor, there is an immense pressure to perform well, as if you die too early, your teammates will also be toast. Secondly, your margin for error is much lower when tunneled right off the hook. You'll still be injured and suffer all of the consequences of it past the initial 15 seconds of unhooked protections. You are only granted one mistake within 15 seconds, you are much easier to track, and some of your perks may not work in the injured state. You also have fewer opportunities to earn blood points and complete quests, as your time will be spent almost entirely in chase or on hook. For the remaining survivors, a 3v1 match early on is often seen as hopeless, and as mentioned previously, it instills a defeatist attitude. Lastly, another point to touch on is the skill gap in tunneling. Tunneling is super easy for the killer to do. All they need to do is pick a survivor and go after them as much as possible and hope they aren't running anti-tunnel. For survivor, in order to combat tunneling, you have to dedicate part of your build to some anti-tunnel effects. This means that you have to preempt what the killer will do before the match is even started and sacrifice your ability to run fun perks in the name of efficiency. This also leads into a pay-to-win element of the game, as certain perks are locked behind DLC characters, some of which are licensed and only available for purchase with real money. With the loss of the Halloween DLC, however, this issue is somewhat relieved, as the poster child of anti-tunnel, Decisive Strike, has been demoted into a general perk now called Will to Live. It also requires coordination for survivors in the ways of protection hits or pallet saves, which disproportionately impacts solo queue. To top it all off, you have to be strong in chase, as you probably only have one health state to work with. Despite tunneling being an issue that has persisted for the lifespan of the game, Behavior has been struggling to come up with satisfying solutions. The only base kit anti-tunnel change that Behavior has implemented are the unhooked protections in the form of Endurance and Haste for a short duration. These originally came about during the 6.1.0 meta shakeup and was deemed as a base kit version of the perk Borrowed Time, as it did essentially the same thing. Because survivors were unhooked with no protections prior to 6.1.0, tunneling was far easier to do, and Borrowed Time was a necessary perk for at least one survivor to bring. Lastly, Behavior implemented this feature-based kit in order to shake up a stagnating meta, as was the goal of the entire update. These unhooked protections have seen a few buffs since their launch. Other than that, all other forms of anti-tunnel effects have been relegated to perks. This is not an amazing solution because, as mentioned previously, it sacrifices build variety and enforces pay-to-win elements. This is not to say perks cannot have anti-tunnel effects, but it becomes an issue when most of your options cost you a perk slot. You may argue that killers have something of a similar problem when it comes to regression perks, which is true, but it's not quite the same. Regression effects provide consistent value as survivors will always be progressing generators. In contrast, killers don't always tunnel aggressively, so the value in anti-tunnel perks become a little less consistent. You may play a few matches in which you don't use Decisive Strike, but of course, the first match you decide to take it off in favor of another perk is the match you need its protections. Before we discuss my anti-tunnel changes, let's go over some important considerations that should be made. I have heard that in the highest level of play, tunneling is a necessity, but to a degree that's just how metas work. You utilize the mechanics of a game to their highest potential, and to a degree the game has been balanced with tunneling in mind. Killers can wrest control of the match by tunneling someone out, but on the flip side, other mechanics need to lean in favor of the survivors because killers can snowball with a well-placed tunnel out. Point is, the history and dynamics of tunneling are very complicated. Another thing to consider is anti-tunnel effects can be used aggressively by survivors. For example, if an injured survivor rescues a hooked survivor, the unhooked survivor can use their endurance to take a hit for the rescuer and prevent them from going down. Similarly, survivors can use off-the-record or Decisive Strike to take protection hits for their teammates in tough situations. With Decisive Strike, you can combo with Unbreakable to force the killer into a lose-lose situation. The killer has to hit you, and they either have to pick you up and eat the Decisive Strike, or they have to leave you on the ground while you pick yourself up for free. In either situation, your teammate gets some distance, and the killer has wasted time. Similarly, we don't want to overbuff survivors with anti-tunnel effects for this reason. And even then, there are certain situations that are unwinnable for the killer. For example, the current unhooked protections linger for 15 seconds and grant a 10% haste bonus. If a survivor is unhooked near an open door, that endurance is entirely possible to last the entire distance to that door. The only thing the killer can do in that situation is to hit them to eat the endurance and follow up with another attack. For killers that have low mobility or lack range, this is often not possible and the survivor escapes for free. This is why behavior has been reticent to implement anti-tunnel features outside of perks. Buffing survivors is a nerf to killer, and behavior tends to never do things in a measured way. We saw this failure in the Crosshair PTP, in which there were massive changes to the hooking system with many anti-tunnel features. This, of course, was way over the top, and behavior subsequently scrapped the whole thing, wasting all that precious development time on features that never made it to live servers. Of course, they then pushed the Crosshair to live with mechanics that were so oppressive that even killer players refused to play her. Like I said, measured responses are not behavior strong suit. So with all of that yapping out of the way, what is my solution to tunneling? Very simply, I think too much focus has been placed on how to solve this problem within the confines of the current hooking system. However, what I think to be an effective answer requires looking past the current hooking mechanics. I'm taking inspiration from the Dead by Daylight board game, which has a different hooking system from the video game. To put it simply, Sacrifice no longer relies on individual hook stages. Hooking survivors now grants Sacrifice progression. When a particular amount of Sacrifice progression is gained, called the Fatal Threshold, any survivor subsequently hooked is instantly sacrificed. Survivors offer more Sacrifice progression the fewer times they have been hooked, and the killer earns additional Sacrifice progression when they have a streak of unique hooks. In other words, you get bonus points if you hook 2 different survivors successfully, with the largest bonus being offered if you hook all 4 survivors once before hooking any of them a second time. These changes both reduce the effectiveness of tunneling and also encourage killers to spread their hooks. In order to help killers secure kills at endgames, the trial enters a mode called Dire Straits once all 5 generators are repaired. During Dire Straits, the Fatal Threshold is reduced and survivors become more vulnerable to sacrifice. Here's a mock-up of a potential game under this new system. The Fatal Threshold is 260 points, while the Dire Straits threshold is reduced to 195 points. A survivor's first hook grants 35 points, their second hook grants 25 points, and their third hook onward grants 15 points. Each unique hook grants 0, 5, 10, and then 15 points each. On the right, I have 2 graphs to show 2 different games. The left-hand graph depicts a perfect game in which the killer hooks each survivor once before repeating. In this game, the killer reaches their Fatal Threshold in 7 hooks and reaches the Dire Straits threshold in 5 hooks. In other words, they start sacrificing survivors on their 8th hook or their 6th hook during endgame. In contrast, the right-hand graph depicts a tunneling game under the system in which the killer hooks the same survivor 3 times in a row before moving on to the next survivor. Due to the diminishing returns of later hook stages and the missed bonuses for unique hooks, this killer reaches the Fatal Threshold after 10 hooks and the Dire Straits threshold after 7 hooks. Not only does the tunneling killer take longer to sacrifice survivors, but they no longer gain the benefit of a 3v1 under these rules. In contrast, the optimal play actually offers earlier sacrifices in this potential system than the same plays would under the current hooking system. Another point I'd like to make about this system is how it fits the theme of the game more. The whole point of the trials is to evoke fear, terror, and hope in survivors for the entity to feed off of. By structuring the trials around spreading your hooks, the entity has more emotion to feed off of than desensitizing one survivor to torment over and over again. Now obviously this would be a massive buff to Survivor, as their ability to survive until endgame has been massively enhanced. In order to compensate for this system, a few alterations should be made for the killer side. The first change is hooking bonuses similar to barbecue and chili in order to help them identify survivors that will grant them the highest bonus. I would implement these under Killer Instinct so that these bonuses cannot be completely evaded by survivors through lockers and certain perks. The other primary change would be to increase survivor objectives. Because the killer's objective has been made harder, it feels like a pretty straightforward answer to simply make the survivor's objective harder. I would increase total generator repairs by 90 charges, 1 additional generator's worth of time, at least as a starting point. Across 5 generators, this would bring each generator's charge count to 108. Another small change would be to increase the base regression speed. Currently, generators naturally regress at a rate of 1 charge every 4 seconds, and I would increase this to 1 charge every 3 seconds. This enhances the strength of passive regression and enables killers to more confidently leave generators alone. Additionally, exit gates now take a little longer to open in order to give the killer more time during the fatal threshold. Alternatively, we could funnel a larger chunk of objective time from generators into exit gates to further prolong the endgame, but I think this would require more care in altering current mechanics due to things like Haywire and Remember Me existing. Truthfully, at this point, I would consider implementing an additional generator into the trials and simply increase each generator's charge count. In other words, 8 generators spawn and survivors must repair 6. My reasoning is that by increasing generator charge count, you inevitably invite 2 things. Number 1, increased charge count makes progression and regression effects more powerful. For example, Pain Resonance regresses a generator by 20% of its maximum progression. With 90 charged generators, this equals 18 charges, but with 108 charges, this equals 21.6 charges. Secondly, increased charge counts makes holding a 3-gen more reliable, especially with the enhanced regression speed. The more charges survivors need to repair, the longer a 3-gen can be held. By splitting the charges off into another generator, it does not buff regression events, and survivor progression effects are offset by the need to run between generators, and 3-gens would be less of an issue. This would require alterations to every map in the game, but this is already a large enough project, so what's more work? Not like I'm coding this shit. Lastly, I would also consider a flat nerf to survivor exhaustion perks. This could or could not actually happen depending on if these other changes are enough to counterbalance the new hook system, but it is another avenue to consider. There are 3 ways we can nerf exhaustion perks. Number 1, we could reduce the haste bonus granted by them. Number 2, we can reduce the duration of the haste. Or number 3, we could increase the exhaustion inflicted per use. I would forego the first option, as I think exhaustion perks are best as a short burst of speed to get you into a better position. Reducing the speed would probably be the worst feeling change out of the 3. If we reduce the duration of each haste effect, it would weaken the distance granted by each perk. For example, Sprint Burst causes you to gain an additional 6 meters of distance for its duration. For each half second the haste is reduced, it loses 1 meter of distance. This would make it easier for killers to catch survivors, as they have less of a chance to reach the safety of a pallet or window. This could also be useful in balancing exhaustion perks against themselves, as more universal exhaustion perks like Sprint Burst or Lithe could get nerfed harder than more situational exhaustion perks like Smash Hit or Balanced Landing. Now, not all exhaustion perks grant haste, such as Dead Hard or Head On. They're a little weird, but Dead Hard has been fiddled with a lot already, and Head On is something of a meme perk anyway, so I'm just gonna let them sit this one out for today. Not to say they completely escape a pass-through, but this video is going to be long enough as it is. The last option of increasing exhaustion timers is also viable. The longer the durations, the less likely it is for survivors to have their perks off cooldown at the start of each chase. Sprint Burst would be the most impacted by this, but it is simultaneously the most universal exhaustion perk, which I think is a fair counterbalance. I would start with each exhaustion perk having their exhaustion increased by 50%, meaning perks like Sprint Burst or Lithe now have 60-second cooldowns, whereas perks like Smash Hit and Background Player have 30-second cooldowns. Now, all of these changes are theoretical, so truthfully I could not tell you if these numbers are appropriate and fairly accommodate the other changes made. The only way to know this for sure would be through significant playtesting, which unfortunately I do not have the means to do. At the end of the day, I'm looking to identify effective mechanical changes than to nitpick the numbers. Evidently, with such massive changes to the hooking system, numerous perks would become much worse and would likely require some tweaking in order to remain relevant. Now, I'll only be going over Decisive Strike and Shoulder the Burden, as I believe these 2 perks are the only ones to be significantly impacted by these changes. While other perks may be weakened, I think they still serve a functional purpose and would likely only need a few small tweaks to be adapted to the system. The first perk, of course, is the king of anti-tunnel, Decisive Strike. Decisive Strike activates for 60 seconds after being unhooked. During this window, being picked up by the killer triggers a skill check that instantly releases you if succeeded. DS temporarily deactivates upon performing conspicuous action and permanently deactivates when you use it or reach endgame. Since you're less desirable as a target under this new system, it loses most of its value. That being said, you come off the hook injured and may still be an easier down for your healthy teammate, so I still think it occupies an important niche. That being said, I made 2 changes. The first is that DS no longer permanently deactivates upon use. Each time the killer tunnels you off hook, you are afforded an opportunity to use it. Because this can be used aggressively by survivors, I accordingly cut the active duration by 1/3 down to 40 seconds in line with off the record. Hopefully this would hit the sweet spot of being useful for anti-tunnel and bad for bully squads. I could still see this being a problem though, so I'd be happy to hear your suggestions. Shoulder the Burden enables a survivor to unhook another survivor and take on one of their hook states. Due to the strength of this effect, it is counterbalanced by an exposed effect on the Altruist. Because shoveling hook stages is essentially worthless now, Shoulder the Burden needs massive alteration. However, I do think the options are limited, but here are my thoughts. Shoulder the Burden now allows you to unhook a survivor and instantly heal them. However, you must be healthy when you do so, and you become injured and broken for 40 seconds. After this duration elapses, you are healed back to healthy. This change essentially allows you to confer your health state to an unhooked survivor. Now, this is already extremely similar to For the People, so the limited application via unhooking is offset by the fact you get your health state back later. To summarize these changes, here is a small list of pros and cons. The benefits of this change are that it turns the current game mechanics on their heads, and now functionally makes tunneling impossible, which would, in my opinion, make the game more fun on average for Survivor, as the frustrations that come with tunneling are non-existent. You get to remain in the game for its duration, and you are no longer the crux of the team's success. Another benefit is that it encourages a new way to play for killers compared to the current system. Currently, killers are offered no reward for spreading their hooks other than through a few perks such as Pain Resonance. And even in those cases, removing a survivor from play is still an equally tantalizing option. The current system does little to reward killers for spreading their hooks, whereas this new system grants you benefits for doing so. On a related note, it would cause a significant shift in the meta away from some of the more common anti-tunnel perks. This could be beneficial as survivors can reliably run more fun and memey perks. But on the other hand, this would potentially strengthen meta builds further as you can now allocate more perk slots to things like exhaustion or gen speeds. It does sound a little scary, but a meta will always form and subsequent meta shifts could be analyzed and altered as needed. The meta shifting shouldn't be the primary concern, but of course should be monitored. Another downside of this system is that it increases team-based burdens. Now survivors are much more team-focused as their teammates' mistakes directly harm their chances of survival. In certain situations, you may end up with a survivor who does not get chased once in a match until endgame, and then die because their teammates provided the killer too much sacrifice progression. It would feel pretty bad. That said, similar situations do already happen with the more productive members of the team being left for dead by their less than ideal allies. Bill players, I'm looking at you. Another downside, although this may not necessarily be a downside for some, is that games will probably run longer. The fact survivors should generally last the duration of the match combined with the increased generator time should cause the average match length to be greater than before. I don't think this is a huge consideration, but it could affect queue times as killer players are locked into each match for longer. It could also be a worse feel for people who want their DBD matches to be quicker and more casual. Another issue is that this hooking system is less intuitive than the current system. Players only need to know how to count to 3. The current system would be far more obscure for players to know exactly who they need to hook next, but if we were to keep the current hook state counter, perhaps with enhanced information, players should be able to get a decent guesstimate on which survivors will be the biggest reward. Lastly, this system could also give rise to an increased slugging. While the system is intended to encourage killers to spread their hooks, slugging still does offer similar pressure, and the inability to remove a survivor prematurely may discourage killers from hooking altogether. Now, I do think a large number of killer players try to spread their hooks when there's no pressure to tunnel, so this system isn't a huge change to the overall playstyle for these players. However, for the killers who play much more aggressively, this could be a big departure from a typical playstyle. Combined with the fact that the DBD community can be reactive, I could see a portion of killer players running full slug builds and protest were these changes to happen, even if the other adjustments were perfectly adequate from the get-go. While it does seem like this system introduces some issues, no changes are without flaw, but I think the downsides are relatively small and do already exist in a certain capacity. It does an incredibly efficient job at eliminating the target with minimal alterations to other existing mechanics. I think at the end of the day, as numbers were tweaked and needed adjustments were made, it would be similar to the 6.1.0 meta shakeup where it's just a new version of the game players would need time to adjust to. Thanks for watching, leave a like, and put your thoughts in the comments below.